Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Elizabeth Thompson, the editor of the Nevada Independent. As you saw there on your screen, just before we came back, we're here to talk about the crisis on the Colorado River. Very pleased to be doing this panel this morning here. One of the most crucial topics, I think, that affects not only Nevada, but the entire Southwest United States, and indeed climate change is affecting everyone across the country and the globe. I'm very pleased with who we have with us today for the conversation. To my left is environmental reporter Daniel Rothberg, who will be doing most of the moderating. Today I'll jump in on occasion. To his left is the current GM of the Southern Nevada Water Authority, John Ensminger. To his left is the former GM of the Southern Nevada Water Authority, and there's so many other titles I could drop, but I won't. Pat Milroy is well known around the state for her expertise in the water realm. Assemblyman Watts, second-term legislator, who I hope will be answering some questions about what we can expect coming up in the session, and researcher and professor Elizabeth Kobele, from UNR, has flown down from the north to join us for this conversation as well. So the Colorado River in crisis. This is not news to anyone at this point. Our very own Lake Mead is Exhibit A, with Las Vegas now getting about 90% of its water from the river. The Water Authority has been taking steps to secure Nevada's supply through conservation and through the construction, thank goodness, right, of that low-level intake, the third straw, as we call it, at the lake that can access water that other states on the compact cannot. First question is for you, John Ensminger. I think you were in Santa Fe recently, meeting with the other members of the Colorado River Compact. Can you give us a brief update on how those negotiations are going?
Sure, happy to do so. I guess I would say there are some promising signs that California and Arizona are beginning to realize that additional steps need to be taken, but certainly nothing substantive enough to meet the challenge that the Interior Department has laid down. For those unfamiliar, in June, Commissioner Tootin of the Bureau of Reclamation testified in front of the Senate that the entire basin, all 7 states and the country of Mexico have to reduce their usage by between 2 to 4 million acre feet of water, which right now we're using about 15. So cutting 2 to 4 out of 15 is a monumental task, and thus far, the basin states and the federal government haven't come anywhere close to coming up with an adequate plan for that.
As you know, I think was covered in the video that played before. Nevada has a very small portion of the Colorado River. It's about 1.8% of the full Colorado River rights in the compact, and what's known as the law of the river, just some of the agreements. And over the years, as Las Vegas has grown, the city's really stretched out its water supply through conservation. And I'm wondering, Pat, if you can tell us a little bit about kind of those current efforts, where we are today, and sort of how far conservation can go into the future, especially with the kind of conditions that the river is in.
Well, I think John pointed out very succinctly, there's only one arrow in our quiver, and that's conservation at this point, whether it's in Nevada or whether it's in any one of the other states. John and the authority have set a goal of 86 gallons per person per day for Southern Nevada. I think we're at 110 now, John?
That's right.
And I think it's doable, but it won't be without pain. And look, the conservation is a journey. It's not an event, and it's going to take time for people to make the necessary changes in order to adapt to that. We've had great successes in the past in taking out turf. It's still being taken out. There's still a lot of unused turf out there that can be removed. But now we're having to look at uses such as evaporative coolers, putting the golf courses on new water budgets, and even doing the antithetical of limiting pool sizes. That's not sitting well with a lot of people, and I completely appreciate that. But there's no other choice. It has to be done. And if Southern Nevada does that, as painful as it is, I mean, look what conservation's achieved for us. We've been able to stay ahead of the cuts. Arizona went through an incredibly painful year last year, having to cut left and right. They weren't prepared. By bringing the community along gradually and allowing the adjustments to happen over time, by the time you get to the point where you have to cut back because the river conditions dictate it, you're already there. I mean, that was the philosophy all along, and I think it has worked well. And I think with what the authority is doing now, they are doing the absolute right thing.
If every state in the compact was as, let's say, aggressive as Nevada in pre-planning, how much of a difference would that really make at this point?
Well, I think each of the communities would probably be more resilient if they had. And look, I don't want to belittle some of the efforts that have occurred in Southern California, in the urban area, and in Arizona, because, I mean, Tucson for many, many years was the poster child for conservation. I mean, they were the first out of the box. So I don't want to be disparaging toward any of our neighbors. They've just got an ugly period of time ahead of them as they make these transitions. And that's what's making the discussion so difficult. And then you have to remember, Elizabeth, the majority of the use is still agriculture. And I am not going to bash agriculture. I'm not a big believer in that. I mean, we do like to eat. And our favorite adversaries who, you know, use a lion's share of California's allocation also happen to be 15% of the winter's fruits and vegetables for the United States. However, they do mostly still grow forage crops, right? Which is sent to dairy farms in Central California and other places in the West. And they export 1.5 billion in forage crops into Asia every year. So it's going to, for them, it's going to be very difficult. And one of their major challenges is balancing out the Salton Sea. You send less water to the Imperial Irrigation District, less water finds its way to the Salton Sea. Because at the end of the day, all that sea is irrigation runoff.
Well, I want to turn, we're going to get back to the Salton Sea, hopefully. But I want to turn to Assemblyman Watts, and I guess when the Southern Nevada Water Authority, Nevada is unique in the sense that its Colorado River rights are used, mainly by one entity, the Southern Nevada Water Authority, and in one kind of geographic area of the state. And I'm curious, though, as looking at this from a state perspective, as somebody who is in state government, you worked on the non-functional turf bill. You sponsored the non-functional turf bill last year to remove non-functional turf, decorative, ornamental turf from the Las Vegas Valley. I'm curious what role you see for the legislature, both looking at the situation in Southern Nevada and also more globally across the basin.
Sure. I think that when it comes to Southern Nevada, it has to be a partnership. It has to be a partnership with the Water Authority. It has to be a partnership with local governments. But the state also has a role to play. Different powers and authorities are kind of apportioned out to all those different entities. And so there are times when the state needs to step in with policy that can help assist Southern Nevada in advancing some of its conservation objectives. At the same time, as a legislator, I'm also looking at how some of these things can apply on a statewide level. Every water basin, every community is different in kind of what their water resources look like, and the solutions are going to vary somewhat from community to community. In my first legislative session, I worked on legislation to make sure that there was more efficient indoor use of water. again, the impact that that has on Southern Nevada with return flow credits is different from other communities. But that's statewide because at the end of the day, it's something that is cost effective and smart to help save our water resources. So I do think that there are some things that we can work on at a statewide level, even if they don't necessarily have an impact or as great of an impact in Southern Nevada. It's important for conserving the resource in some of our other communities. So that's really how I see it. Sometimes there's a really effective role for the legislature to play in helping to move things forward in Southern Nevada. And other times there are solutions that we have to work on that help address the communities and the sectors across the state. Because while we have a crisis on the Colorado River, we also have, I think over 20% of the groundwater basins in Nevada are severely over-allocated. We've seen the Truckee River reach dangerous low levels. Lake Tahoe drop below its natural rim. So water scarcity and water issues aren't unique to Southern Nevada. They affect the entire state and the entire region.
So that was a great preamble. What's going to happen at the legislature? Can you tell us about any bill draft requests that already exist or are being worked on? What are the next steps?
Sure. So I chaired the Interim Natural Resources Committee in between sessions. We just had our work session in August and are moving forward a couple of measures. One is specifically around conservation in Southern Nevada. So just like we worked with the Water Authority on addressing non-functional turf last session, one of the things that John has talked about and it's been shown in how we get to that lower per capita usage is addressing septic systems. We have thousands, I think perhaps 15,000 septic systems in the Las Vegas Valley. That water doesn't go into our wastewater system, so it doesn't create return flow. What it is doing is increasing nitrate levels in our groundwater here in Southern Nevada, so it is also a water quality issue. We need to figure out how we're going to go about making sure that problem doesn't get any worse and start to replace those septic systems and get people connected to wastewater. Again, that helps bring us closer to having a circular water system in the Las Vegas Valley. So we're going to work on that. We're looking at other conservation initiatives that we can take and work on at the state level to help Southern Nevada. And then we're also going to be looking, again, statewide at some of the water policy, making sure that science is at the forefront of all the decision-making processes for the management of water in our state.
My next question is for Professor Cobley. You've looked at sort of some of these governance questions on the Colorado River and in kind of water negotiations in general. And already we've heard, a lot of terms that are kind of well known to people probably in the Colorado River community, but maybe not as publicly, the Imperial Irrigation District, the Salton Sea. There's a ton of moving parts to all of this stuff. And I guess I'm kind of curious from your perspective, zooming out, Nevada is, with the third intake, with return flow credits, with conservation, Nevada has done a good job in securing its Colorado River supply. At the same time, it's a part of this larger Colorado River picture and the crisis at Lake Mead, and as John mentioned, part of getting to these cuts that the federal government has called for. I'm curious if you could sort of tell our audience, why is it so difficult to bring all of these partners and entities together? Where are some of the dividing lines, and why is it what about water makes it so difficult to kind of come to an agreement?
Yeah, that's a really great question,
Yeah.
Daniel. Thank you very much for asking that. I think one of the things that a lot of our panelists have already alluded to is that the Colorado River system is managed by such a diversity of actors across so many levels. We've talked a little bit already about the federal government's role and asks from the federal government to cut 2 to 4 million acre feet in order to help us reach a level of greater sustainability on the Colorado River. We have individual water districts, we have individual water users, states, legislatures, all of these different actors that are coming together. And I think that that system inherently makes managing water on the Colorado River really difficult. I also think that we have competing uses over a resource that's critical for all of our livelihoods, and at its core, that's one of the most challenging problems on the Colorado River. So we are providing water to municipalities, but as Pat mentioned, we have a vibrant agricultural community in the Colorado River. We're seeing new uses for recreation, new calls for environmental protection, all of these different industrial uses throughout the basin. So I think that really the diversity of actors and the diversity of uses is one of the things that makes managing the Colorado River so challenging. I also think that in this particular moment, as we're talking about kind of this panel, the crisis on the Colorado River, one of the things that I think a lot about is the timeline of that crisis. We are having to deal with these immediate challenges right now. Whether it's thinking about if we're going to release water from Powell to Meade, or if we need to hold back water to protect infrastructure in Lake Powell, while we're also thinking about these really long-term challenges. So policymakers on the Colorado River are in the beginning stages of a really complex renegotiation process for some of the major rules that govern the Colorado River, and having to balance these short-term crises and responses that are completely necessary with also thinking about those long-term governance strategies way past 20 years from now. That's a really hard position to be in. It's hard to think long-term and think about sustainability if we're having trouble managing even these immediate crises. So I think some of those issues, the diversity of actors, the timelines and scales of these problems are what makes the management of the Colorado River really challenging.
Yeah, I want to go to John because you're sort of at the center of all of that. There's all the negotiations, all of these sort of disparate interests, different sectors, urban, ag, the different water rights holders. I'm curious, we've mentioned that Nevada has kind of is consuming less than its full Colorado River allocation, which is, the smallest of the 7 basin states. But I'm curious, with these broader negotiations going on, what's sort of on the table right now, and how do you see it affecting Nevada potentially?
Well, there's a lot of posturing going on right now, and I think Pat kind of alluded to it. Just talking about IID, every user on the river has well-worn talking points about why their use is critical, what the horrific impacts to their community will be if they're made to cut back. And that's mostly what you hear about. You don't hear people volunteering of how they're going to contribute to the problem. I'll start in the upper basin. So you have Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico collectively using 3.5 to 4 million acre feet of water when their legal entitlement under the 1922 compact is 7.5 million acre feet. So their talking points are, A, we're not using our full legal entitlement. The whole deal was you guys were going to get to use yours early, and then we were going to have a chance to grow into ours, and we shouldn't be bearing the full brunt of climate change, which is fair. And at the same time saying, but nevertheless, we are willing to make contributions, we are willing to help, but if every drop of water we save is just going to be released downstream while California is still using more than their 4.4 million acre feet of water, why in the world are we going to go through that sort of political pain and on the ground pain to our urban and rural areas if it's not actually contributing to the solution, right? And then you turn to Arizona, who made the brilliant decision in 1968 to agree to take a junior priority position for the Central Arizona project in order to get federal funding. And you got California sitting there saying a deal's a deal, and you made that deal. But at the same time now, you're in a position where about half of the Central Arizona's water supply goes to tribal nations. And so they're supposed to go to zero before California takes 1 gallon of reduction. So you have these systemic inequities built into the system, and then everybody in California can give you their case of what, the impacts to these agricultural rural areas from these big cutbacks really are going to be difficult. So that's where you get into the rubber meeting the road of there's no choice, right? We do actually have to reduce, because as complex as the politics are, as complex as the legalities are, the math is pretty simple. If we don't make those 2 to 4 million acre feet in reductions, Lake Powell is going to go to dead pool and could do that within the next 12 months. Lake Mead will get to dead pool, and then IID isn't cutting back 10% or 20%, they go to zero. 100% of their water supply comes from the Colorado River, and then that entire economy, is gone. And the Salton Sea isn't getting 1 drop of water. So at some point, we're gonna have to set aside our talking points and get to the math.
I've got 2 follow-ups, John. So the first one is just explain for people in the audience or watching who don't know what dead pool means. What does that mean?
Okay, so in both reservoirs, in both Lake Powell and in Lake Mead, you get to an elevation where it is physically impossible to release water through the dam. You still have a little bit of water left in the dams or in the reservoirs at that point, but that's the point I like to tell people. That's when the law of gravity takes over for the law of man, right? Because you cannot get water through the dam. And that is our primary strategic advantage on this river, that starting under Pat's leadership when we built the 3rd intake into Lake Mead, and then in 2014 began work on the low lake level pump station. Between those 2 pieces of infrastructure, we can pump water out of the lake at elevation 860 and dead pools at 895. So under any hydrologic scenario, we're gonna have 35 feet of water over our intakes, but at dead pool, you can't release water through Hoover Dam. That's the water supply, primary water supply for 25 million Americans, 3 million acres of irrigated agriculture, and the states of Sonora and Baja in the country of Mexico.
So in light of how crucial that point you just made was, and in light of all of the governmental and political entities that are at war with each other, you'd explained it so well, John, right, about everyone thinks their use is critical. That's A. B, why should we try harder than everyone else, right? So everyone kind of digs in. Do you think it's either likely or probable that the federal government is just going to have to come in and lay down the law at some point because the parties cannot get on board?
It's certainly a possibility.
And that would be unprecedented, correct? I mean, has anything like this, correct me if I'm wrong, has anything of this scope and size driven by water scarcity ever happened in this country before, to the point that we're talking about federal government involvement?
Well, the federal government has certainly threatened unilateral action before. The lead up to the 2007 interim guidelines that basically controlled the operation of Lakes Mead and Powell now was a direct result of Interior Secretary Norton threatening to unilaterally impose shortage guidelines. The drought contingency plan that was approved by Congress in 2019 was a direct result of reclamation threatening to impose additional cuts onto the state. So as much as the Colorado River is sometimes held out as this model of cooperation and collaboration, we've never actually entered into any voluntary agreements without a federal threat, with the gun pointed at our head. And so I think that's the federal threats on the table now. But the question really becomes, they've never actually had to follow through with it. And what does that follow through look like? Because there's ambiguity in their authorities. No one knows exactly what following through would mean, which in itself is probably good because no one has absolute certainty that they're going to win or lose. But without reaching that consensus agreement amongst the water users, any federal follow-through is probably going to result in litigation.
Pat, I wanted to ask, John mentions that Southern Nevada has the third intake. They have this sort of security if things continue to deteriorate on the river. What is at stake for Nevada? I mean, what is at stake if the states and everyone at the negotiating table can't get to an agreement to cut however much the Bureau of Reclamation is saying needs to be cut?
Well, I think for Nevada, the stakes, yes, we can still continue to take water, but can you imagine nothing is going downstream? Southern California with 20 million people, 8 million across the river over in Arizona, all have no water. Can you imagine the political pressure that will come down on Nevada to cut as deep as they possibly can? Now, John's not going to say this because he's not going to negotiate against himself, and I don't blame him.
Well, and you shouldn't negotiate against us either.
I'm just being a realist. I mean, I've always been a realist. I mean, it will be there. I mean, I don't think Southern Nevada will be cut off, but it will be ugly. And what will really happen is the panic button will be hit, right? And when the parties hit the panic button, it is nigh impossible to get across the finish line. Mm-hmm. There's like this sweet spot. You have enough of a threat, you have enough fear that you're willing to move, mm-hmm. but you haven't gone off the cliff yet. Mm-hmm. Once you go off the cliff, the wheels come off the wagon. This system cannot collapse. Not just from a water perspective, from an energy perspective. I mean, you look at any of the stories on the Colorado River, and these tribes aren't living in wealth and luxury, right? I mean, for them, it is their survival as well. You can't let this system fail. And I think slowly but surely, California loves to think like a bubble, right? They live in their own little bubble. There's so many people in California, they forget there's a rest of the United States. So it's sinking in that they too are dependent on their neighbors. And that's the bottom line here. This is one whole. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And if everybody doesn't recognize their own unique position in that whole, this is all going to come crashing down around us.
I want to ask Elizabeth about that because, John mentioned that California is using more than its allocation this year, but that is allowed by the current rules.
Oh, yes, it is.
What?
Yes, it is.
And I think it's an important point to make is that the current rules allow some of this stuff, have allowed Lake Mead to get to this point, have allowed Lake Powell to get to this point. And I'm curious when you think about the Colorado River and a path forward, and you mentioned that there's sort of two courses right now. There's dealing with these, short-term or immediate crises, and there have been a few this year with Lake Powell and now with cutting to sort of stabilize the reservoirs next year. And then there's this longer-term thinking about what does the governance look like? What do the guidelines look like for operating the system? How do you kind of see things moving in the future? Like what can be avoided? What can be done to sort of avoid the situation that we're in now, where we have these rules that allow for this continued overuse?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I'll start by echoing the point that we need to think about the Colorado River Basin as a system, and that the idea that states have these individual allocations and even the kind of upper basin thinking of we have room to develop into our full share. That's not the reality of the system anymore. And I think rethinking about the system as a whole, the interdependencies, some of those interdependencies that we haven't considered in the past. Pat brought up tribes, and I think that that's a really important role going forward on the Colorado River. Due to some complex legal history, tribes have slightly different types of water rights on the Colorado River than other water users, and we haven't done a good job integrating tribes into Colorado River management in a fair, just, equitable way. And in turn, that also has introduced a lot of uncertainty for other water managers in the basin who don't know exactly what will happen when tribes enter this conversation or decide to use their water rights. So I think really thinking about the basin as a system, thinking about those interdependencies is going to be critical for rethinking how we design the rules for the basin post 2026, which is sort of when our next long-term guidelines go into effect. And we're just starting the process of fleshing out those solutions right now. Initial comments are just coming in about what that might look like, potentially everything from adjusting allocations based on the flow of the river versus these static numbers, rethinking sort of the percentage base versus raw number of million acre feet allocations. All of these sorts of things are going to be really important, and I think we are only going to make progress on thinking through those when we think about the basin as a whole and the interdependencies. One last thing I'll add, and I think John alluded to this a little bit, is that the Colorado River Basin has sort of been held up as this bastion of collaboration in the past, and we know that there are actually some forces, like the federal government pressure, that have worked to catalyze that collaboration. And I think that going forward, collaboration doesn't mean that every user needs to agree with each other and be perfectly happy about what's going on in the river, but I think it means thinking broadly, again, about those interdependencies, about the Colorado River Basin as a system, and being willing to think about those shared challenges that we face and making our decisions from that standpoint rather than the standpoint of kind of defending the initial allocations that states had.
Does that mean that we need, I do hate to propose a new government agency, but
Oh, please, no. Not another government agency.
Okay, so then,
We have a water master in the lower basin.
based on what our academic researcher just said, and I think most of us realize, of course, it is a systemic problem, right? You can't separate one drop of water upriver from other drops of water downriver. It doesn't make any sense. But how do we get through? We're locked up right now, right? We've got all these competing parties. Nobody wants to cooperate. You just explained beautifully where our headspace should be. What needs to change then in the governmental systems that exist? What needs to give?
Yeah, I don't want to propose a new governmental agency either. But I do think, maybe this is my inner political scientist coming out, but I think that a lot of attention in the past has been paid to the substantive issues of how we manage water in the basin, and a lot less has been paid to the processes and the institutions that we use to bring people together in the basin. So I think maybe rethinking those, rethinking incentives, coming together to think about how large amounts of money is spent, like for instance, the new sort of infusion of the money into the Colorado River Basin through the Inflation Reduction Act, working to think through those in kind of a more collaborative way, setting up rules for states to work together. I think those things, we don't have it figured out yet, but I think that's a really important part of this renegotiation process. Yes, we need to focus on the water issues and the allocation amounts and those sort of substantive questions, but we also need to really just be thinking about the governance structure as well.
Pat, what do you think needs?
Can I jump in real quick?
Oh, go ahead, Howard. Let's go right down the row because it looks like everyone has thoughts. So, Assemblyman Watts, go ahead.
Sure. Well, as a proud Nevadan, I think you've heard already about some of the things that we've done to lead. And so I think it's worth lifting up that we do have a role to play in bringing that leadership. It's a collective action problem and a math problem. And we've been out in front, not only with things like the third intake that kind of provide us some certainty and some protection against some of these consequences, but also in conservation, and not just here in Southern Nevada, but also creating collaborations to help advance water recycling in California and other things. So I think that we have a role to play in showing that, for example, when we're removing non-functional turf, it's not going to be the end of the world. It's already happening, it's going underway, and it is a path that other communities can take. I think that that's one of the things that we can do to help move the ball forward and take some of those initial steps forward to show other communities on the river that they can take these steps and need to, and if they do those things now, we're going to be set up for greater success down the road. And to Elizabeth's point about resources, that's one of the things that I think we need to do, and I am really excited about some of the recent allocations made through the Inflation Reduction Act. You know, we had a massive investment of federal resources to allow the West to grow. First agriculturally through the original Reclamation Act, then through the development of these large reservoirs providing hydropower and water to communities across the West. That was a time of expansion. This is a time of crisis. I think the response needs to be the same. And again, not only at the state level, but at the federal level. So when we talk about federal action, we also need to talk about federal resources and a combined effort politically and financially to address this issue.
Pat Mulroy, do you agree with what Assemblyman Watts just said?
Yes, I heard what he said. No, I don't
agree
disagree.
with it?
I don't disagree. But I think we need, and I'm just going to go ahead and say it, we can't conserve our way out of this. This is the only arrow we have in our quiver right now, but at some point, it has to be augmented. The system has to be augmented. Now, the recycling projects that SNWA is participating in Southern California is a great first step, but we're going to have to turn our eyes to the ocean. We're going to have to supplant some existing uses with desalted ocean water. It's just that simple. And there's going to have to be a stair-step exchange back up the system.
So which of you knows most about desalinization?
Pardon?
Which four of you, I'm going to ask a desalinization question and I need to know who to toss it to. Which of you knows the most, do you think? Is that you, John?
I get my chance at the governance.
I want to answer to you.
I guess I would caution, I freely admit, the 7 states had a really, really bad summer. We publicly embarrassed ourselves and came up with absolutely nothing in the face of a very clear call to action from the federal government. But before we toss out what has in fact been an extremely successful negotiation process that has produced numerous wins over the last 20 years, I think we need to be careful about that. We haven't failed yet. And while it probably looks opaque from the outside, this is not 7 governor's reps in some backfilled room trying to come up with stuff. The relationships, the governance network on the river, I talk to tribal representatives and environmental groups all the time. There actually is a fairly well-functioning community on the Colorado that's trying to talk these things through. When I testified in front of the Senate in June, and Senator Manchin asked me if I could do one thing for the river, if I could get the federal government to do one thing, what would I do? And I didn't ask for anything for Nevada, I didn't ask for anything for Las Vegas. I said you need to make a massive investment in agricultural efficiencies so that we can continue to grow the same amount of food we have, we continue to support these rural communities, but we do it with substantially less water. So, I'm not 100% sure the existing governance structure is going to deliver the win, but I'm cautious about wholly replacing something that has been really functional over the last 25 years, right as we're in, this moment of crisis.
And you think agricultural efficiency is more of a next step than desalinization, or is it both?
No, they're both. It's both.
Yeah,
There's no one silver bullet. It's going to have to be, as I've so often said, it's a smorgasbord of various pieces, a mosaic that has to come together. And listen, I agree wholeheartedly with John. That letter he sent was superb. That letter laid it out as succinctly and as clearly as anyone possibly could, exactly what needs to happen in the short term. But let's not look to the federal government to be able to come in with a sledgehammer and be able to swing it and effectuate the changes we need. Water is a state right under the Constitution. Let's never forget that. The compact was there for a very important reason, and it did its job. It got rid of first in time, first in right in a river system where one state could have lost all its water supply to California. Nevada wouldn't exist if the compact didn't exist. California would have sucked that water into their boundaries a long time ago. So it's not broken, it's just that it has to be able to build the political courage to move to the next level. And that's where it becomes excruciatingly difficult right now.
That's actually a good segue into the question I wanted to ask Assemblyman Watts, because I think one thing that's really interesting about the Colorado River and water in general is a lot of the solutions are pretty distributed. They're not always a one-size-fits-all solution because these places are pretty unique. And I'm curious, with your work in the legislature and working on bill drafts and stuff, what are you hearing from constituents? What are, and are people coming, are the sort of interest groups that that are needed to be at the table to solve these solutions on the local level and move conservation kind of forward? You mentioned septic systems, evaporative cooling's been mentioned, pool sizes, things like that. Are those parties sort of coming to the table? Do they see the larger picture and some of the stuff that we're talking about today?
I think overwhelmingly, yes, they do. I mean, you look at the non-functional turf removal bill that we passed in the legislature last year, passed with bipartisan support, with support from all of the conservation community, but as well as members of the business community, folks that don't often see eye to eye on some of these issues. Again, the reality is kind of staring everyone in the face, and there are opportunities to get everyone together to advance conservation or other policies that help protect our water resources. And I think that when you look at evaporative cooling and some of these other things, folks see a benefit to calling out the problem clearly and taking steps to address it now, so that we don't end up in a position where the water supply is in jeopardy or we have to take dramatic actions all at once. So, I think that, and when it comes to constituents, I mean, water is, I think, the number one issue that folks in our community are understanding the impacts of climate change, and the number one concern that folks have. It is something that everyone sees. They see the decline in Lake Mead. I've seen it from going to basically full when I was growing up to where it is now. And people want to know what we're going to do about it. And as everyone on this panel has kind of discussed, it's very complex, and it's not just something that Southern Nevada alone can fix. But we are going to have to take action, and again, provide some of that leadership, I think, to the region as well. And that's something that I think constituents, voters, and a broad range of people, just as we've talked about all these unique interest groups, if we can start to craft something that says, we're not going to ask you to give up water to benefit somebody else, we're all going to do our part in order to get this system into balance, I think that starts to provide the opportunity to build these unlikely coalitions of support to take action that we need.
Assemblyman, do you mind? I want to ask a follow-up question. So I think I get more email from readers of the Indy on water issues these days than any other issue, and some of those readers, I imagine, are your constituents too. And the thing that they're all the most upset about, we haven't mentioned yet, which is growth and development and how that affects water use, and why are we talking about conservation when we're still, right, building out here in the valley at the fastest pace we can possibly manage. And by the way, folks up in Reno, Washoe as well now, because of the level at the Truckee that they're seeing, are also quite worked up about this conflict between development and growth, which is needed for a healthy economy, and water use. Obviously, water is a scarce resource that cannot be replaced in any other way. So is there going to be any talk at the legislature at all of either limiting development or requiring developers to come to the table with more inputs than they have in the past?
So one of the good things that we've done in Nevada is tide development. There has to be water there to support it. And we have seen some instances where proposals have been shot down because the water is not there to support them. So that's one thing that I think folks in the community need to be aware of, is we have to identify a sustainable source. At the same time, we are starting to look in the water projections. When you look at decades out under high growth scenarios, there comes a point where we do not have a definitive, sustainable, long-term source identified. My opinion is that we need to start having those conversations sooner rather than later about at what point do we need to look at addressing that. Part of it is, again, how are we growing? How are we developing? As we've made some of these changes to how we use water over time, we're moving to a system that, at least in Southern Nevada, is much more circular. We have water recycling and other things that can allow you to expand with the water footprint expanding very little. As John likes to talk about, the valley's grown substantially, and we use less water than we used to. So there are some possibilities, but it's about how we grow. What does that building look like? What does the water use look like in our communities? And the other thing I will say is, when we look at the Water Authority's projections, one of the things that impacts how quickly we get to those scenarios, there's really a few factors. How much water is on the river? How much are we using per person per day, and how fast are we growing? And so, I don't think it's a simple issue. If any of these things were simple, we'd have it figured out by now. So these are complex topics, and again, I don't think it's necessarily black or white, where one option is stop growth at this point, and the other option is do nothing and let the market sort it out. We need to have that conversation about, again, what are some guardrails and what are some policy ideas at the state and local levels that can allow us to grow in a sustainable way for the long term.
And just to put, I think, a finer point on it, we've added 750,000 people to this valley since 2002, and we're using 26% less water. This idea that there's this one-to-one correlation between population growth and an increase in water usage simply isn't true. And I think it goes to Howard's point of it is really how you grow. And that's why we're taking these steps of talking about evaporative cooling. That's why we've prohibited the installation of turf anywhere except for schools and parks now, because we essentially need to be able to accomplish over the next 20 years what we accomplished over the last 20 years. And if we're successful in doing that, then you can continue to have diversification of your economy and reasonable population growth. But the day you decide, you're done with conservation, you don't want to do any more hard things, that's when you really have to start talking about, what you can continue to support. And just one other point, just because I want to make sure to compliment Howard on this, he's right about leadership. He sponsored AB 356, during the last legislative session. Governor Sisolak signed it in June of 2021, and now Denver, Aurora, Pueblo, Metropolitan have all signed on to some version of limiting non-functional turf, and we expect by the 1st of November, we're going to add Albuquerque, Santa Fe, Salt Lake, Provo, Orange County, San Diego. Leadership works, spoiler alert.
I want to ask about another big issue that's, Assemblyman Watts mentioned, which is that in addition to some of the systems, kind of, the systems that we have and the allocations that we have, the river is facing the impacts of climate change. Every Colorado River Conference discussion often begins there with just looking at the projections moving into the future, what the last 20 years has looked like on the river. And I'm curious, John, you mentioned all the discussions that the 7 states have had this year. In some of that conflict, I'm curious if the conversation around planning for a future with potentially less water than had been planned for over the past century has advanced at all. Where the different states are on that discussion, on that point?
It's advancing rapidly.
Yeah.
I think the first time I publicly said we needed to plan for a future with a river giving us 11 million acre feet was in Boulder in October last year. And at the time, it was taken with a sort of, oh my goodness, he actually said that. But now, there's a public dialogue around, is 11 low enough? I mean, in Santa Fe, there was an entire panel on 9 to 11 million acre feet. So the consciousness, not just among the states negotiating at the table, but the general public, that, we need to plan, not, for the 22nd century or something, but for the next decade of a river giving us substantially less water than we received in the 20th century, I think is, foremost in everyone's mind. And there's a general acceptance that that is the reality that's facing the river.
Do you think the states agree on a number of what to be planning for?
I think there's general consensus among the states that we need to be planning for a future with at least a low of 11 million acre feet. What is lacking is the general consensus on what everyone's willing to contribute to adjust to that new reality.
Yeah. I'm curious for Pat or Elizabeth, given the kind of last few decades on the river, how do you see climate change being incorporated? How do you plan for something like that? What kind of programs and incentives do you need to get the states to a point where they can really be planning to to adapt to potential repeated years of low inflows on the Colorado River?
Well, I think the first steps for that were already taken in '07.
Yeah.
And then it was continued on with DCP, with the Drought Conservation Plan. I mean, it's incremental, right? You can't expect the states to eat this dinosaur all at once. They're going to eat it one bite at a time. And they have been adapting as conditions have changed. The problem that the states are facing is that the change is happening faster than anybody expected it to happen. I mean, what we're facing here today, I'm supposed to be dead before that happened, right? I mean, it wasn't supposed to happen until way out there into the future. Here it is. I mean, he says 11, that's a great, safe political number. What about 9? I can imagine a scenario where the river runs at 9. And what does that look like? I mean, put your head around it. There's no water in the Grand Canyon. You have no rafting in the Grand Canyon.
Can you give just the audience kind of a brief understanding of how significant 9 would be given all of the rights that currently exist?
The rights are meaningless.
Well, just like
Hang 'em
what
up.
percentage of the pie that...
Worship them every day. They don't mean a Tinker's Dam anymore, right?
There are 18.5 million acre
Okay.
feet in legal entitlement, so it's
Thank
less
you.
than half.
Absolutely. It's not there.
Yeah.
It's like some of the interviews I've watched where certain parties, and I won't name names, said, yes, but we were given that guarantee. We were promised that water. We have it in writing. Whoopee. It's not in the river. It's not there. You know, let's get real here.
Daniel's written, I mean, Daniel, you've been all over this for the past couple of years, and Daniel has written often and used talked about the difference between paper water, which you're alluding to, what are we guaranteed on paper, right, versus what water actually exists and is available.
Thank you.
It's astounding to me that people are still trying to lean on their piece of paper, say like.
Same with their priority. I've told Imperial a million times, I don't care that you have a prior perfected right. If nothing leaves the dam, whoopee.
He's talking about California again with Imperial, just FYI for those of you who aren't aware of that.
Well, Elizabeth, I want to ask about climate change too. I mean, because right now you mentioned there's this ongoing process to rethink the guidelines. There's kind of, I guess, not scoping comments, but pre-scoping comments to kind of set up the process, to talk about what the process should look like. How are you viewing, I mean, going through those comments, talking to different stakeholders, how are people looking at this question of climate change and what it means to be planning for a 9 million acre foot river when you have 18.5 million acre feet of rights, paper, some of them paper, many of them.
Yeah, I think a key factor in how to plan for climate change on the Colorado River is adaptability. And we know that, I mean, this is already sort of baked into the system, right? We have these major reservoirs because we knew historically that there were going to be high flow years and low flow years, and that we needed storage to be able to maintain our water uses in low flow years. And now I feel like that is just kind of in hyperdrive. We need to be thinking about even more adaptability. So I mentioned briefly before, and Pat just alluded to, these numbers on paper don't mean anything if there's not actually water in the river. And so maybe, I don't think we need to throw out this whole system of water rights or the law of the river or anything by any means. We've actually seen it work pretty well, but figuring out how to make that increasingly adaptive over time. So things, like I mentioned before, maybe we're talking about percentages of the river that are shared between states rather than these raw numbers that people hold on to really tightly on paper. I also think it's really critical that we keep learning about how climate change is affecting the basin. Even in the last 5 years that I've been in Nevada, the science has advanced rapidly on this, and we're working on this in a lot of ways in kind of the scientific communities in our universities. I'm an author on the 5th U.S. National Climate Assessment right now, specifically looking at how climate change is affecting water in the southwestern United States, and understanding things like how not just a lower snowpack or changing precipitation patterns, but how drier ground and higher temperatures and those sorts of things are really affecting the river. That science is changing so rapidly, and being able to kind of constantly have that feedback loop between new science and how we're incorporating that into policy is really important. We can't just expect the sort of stationarity in our science that we've used in the past when planning for climate change on the river.
I'm going to give Assemblyman Watts the last word here. As somebody who is an elected official and communicating with constituents who are concerned about these issues, I mean, how are you viewing this? What would you say to someone who is really just concerned on a very elemental level about water in this community moving forward?
I would say a little bit of what I said before, which is that, it's an issue to be concerned about. The solutions are not simple. They're complex. It involves everyone coming together. And that's why it's important that they demand on all of their representatives that they put aside some of their own personal issues and come together to take serious action on this. I'm glad to talk about all the things that we've done here in Nevada and here in Southern Nevada to be leading on this. There's more for us to do. There's more for everyone else to do. And I think there is hope. The system has not crashed yet. We are going to have to do some things that are going to be uncomfortable. They're going to have a cost associated to them. There's going to be some lifestyle changes that we have to make. to readjust to living in an arid western United States region. But if we make those adjustments and we have the courage to take action sooner, we're going to be okay for the foreseeable future.
How nice to end on a hopeful note. Thank you, Assemblyman. Thank you, panelists, very much for this excellent conversation and a much needed one. I'd like to let everyone watching know that in addition to Daniel's stories on our website, you should definitely be subscribing to his Indy Environment newsletter. It's excellent. It comes out almost weekly, and there's usually something about water in it, so I recommend that to all of you. Thanks for your attention. We're going to take a break now, so time to get up and walk around. Thanks.